Writing a complex story featuring hundreds of characters and dozens of storylines is a daunting and difficult task in its own right, particularly when the story in question is written over a time span of many years. Plot holes, timeline inconsistencies, and out-of-character behavior meant to forcibly push the story in a particular direction are all borderline unavoidable oversights and trappings in the process of constructing a complex narrative. Things can get so bad that authors end up putting themselves in a situation where avoiding any of these storytelling trappings makes it nigh impossible to continue their stories in the way and at the pace they initially intended. If you're at all familiar with Game of Thrones, just look up what George R.R. Martin has to say on the Miranese knot. Keeping a story straight becomes even more difficult when an author doesn't just play the role of the writer, but also the main illustrator, needing to design the characters, create panel layouts, and then actually draw everything unfolding. Things get especially insane when the writer-illustrator then has to keep to a weekly schedule of pumping out 17 to 20 pages each week, taking care that each individual chapter is as interesting as possible and ends in such a way that will make the reader want to check the next one the following week. The world of weekly manga serialization is hellish. If you needed any additional proof of that, just take a look at this horrifying equation Togashi-sensei did to calculate the amount of free time he had during his Yu Yu Hakusho run. A solid 3 to 4 hours per week. 3 to 4 hours per week. No wonder his health issues got to be as bad as they are now. Suffice it to say that the weekly manga format isn't conducive to a cohesive and consistent plot, to say the least. And I personally can't name a single long-running manga series that hasn't exhibited the aforementioned trappings to some degree. It's never a matter of if, only how often and to what degree. Hunter x Hunter is not exempt from this at all, especially near the beginning of the series when Togashi was doing his damnness to actually keep the weekly serialization to a weekly schedule. Quite a few major plot inconsistencies occurred, which had profound consequences on the story as a whole. In this video, I'll be listing 5 of what I view to be some of the most egregious and most narratively relevant plot holes, inconsistencies, and retcons in chronological order of their appearance. Let's get into it. Number 1. Specialization's placement in the Nen diagram. I could feel the collective groans of at least a few hundred of you at the moment I said that. Longtime viewers of the channel will be more than well acquainted with this inconsistency, and since I do have multiple videos going into the topic in excruciatingly unnecessary detail, I'll cover it incredibly briefly here. I swear. When we were first introduced to the 6 types of Nen, Izunami told Kurapika that the reason specialization was placed between conjuration and manipulation was a bit arbitrary, since it doesn't really behave like any of the other 5 categories, and was placed between those two simply because the people belonging to them tended to become specialists later on in life more frequently than the members of any other category. However, despite Izunami claiming that its positioning is arbitrary, specialization nonetheless regularly affects the affinity distribution of the other types, meaning that, for example, conjurers and manipulators have a 60% affinity for each other's categories. If its placement was truly arbitrary, they'd of course have an 80% affinity, and realistically, the diagram should have looked more like this, with specialization properly separated from the regular affinity distribution wheel. Now, one could argue that this was simply an error on Izunavi's part and not on Togashi's. As in, isn't it possible that Izunavi, serving the role of a character and not an omniscient narrator, simply made an error or had imperfect information? That doesn't work for 2 reasons. A. Izunavi is a Nen veteran, and the Nen diagram is, together with the 4 principles, the most fundamental and basic aspect of Nen. And B. Kurapika, as a character, is incredibly intelligent, analytical, and, quite frankly, combative. He would have noticed such an obvious error in Izunavi's reasoning and immediately pointed it out, and asked for clarification instead of just letting something as jarring as that slide uncontested. As such, this fumble was obviously not intended to be an in-world character error, but was a slip of the tongue on the part of Togashi-sensei. Now, while the downstream plot-related consequences of this may be minimal, since realistically specialization's placement would change basically nothing with regards to the development of the story and characters proper, the Nen diagram is such an iconic and essential aspect of Hunter x Hunter's world building and power system to make this error warrant at least a brief mention. And yes, that was as brief as I could manage. And just to warn you now, each of these points is longer than the other. Number 2. Kurapika's chains. So, as you're all well aware, Kurapika's strategy for defeating the far stronger, durable, and more experienced brawl-type enhancer that was Uvogin was to make the spider believe that he was actually a manipulator attempting to strike and capture Uvo with real chains, in an attempt to trigger an effect capable of neutralizing this bazooka-tanking, eardrum-bursting, brain-munching, cherry-pit-spitting champion. This tactic worked, as Kurapika, a conjurer, applied into his conjured chains, thereby making them imperceptible to Uvo and successfully incapacitated the spider by forcing him in a state of Zetsu via chain jail, at which point it was game over. See, the trouble is that Uvo really should have known that Pika's chains were conjured. When he was initially captured by Kurapika following his slaughter of the Shadow Beasts, Uvo was completely paralyzed from the neck down owing to Rabadog's venomous fangs, meaning that Kurapika never needed to activate the feature of chain jail that enforced Zetsu on him, and thus risk revealing his ultimate trump card. However, instead of making that horrendous mistake, he instead makes the next worst one and reveals to Uvo that his chains are indeed conjured. Or at least what he did should have revealed that fact. You see, in chapter 77 of the manga, a captured and paralyzed Uvo politely advises Kurapika that he really should kill him instead of doing whatever this was. Kurapika gets miffed at this, and his elevated emotional state resonates through his conjured chains, thus imbuing them with an amazing amount of Nen. This, of course, empowered the chain, which was already specifically made to combat troop members, and, far more importantly for us here, increased its size. An object increasing in size, particularly because of an increase in the user's aura output, is a telltale sign of that object being not entirely physical, but actually created through Nen. Now, one could argue that Uvo, being a straightforward, ball-to-the-wall brawler, may not have recognized this as a telltale sign of a conjured object. Listen, Uvo may not have been a genius, but he wasn't an idiot. He was able to deduce what time it was based solely on the fullness of his stomach, and immediately realized that something was off with Kurapika's Nen capabilities during their fight. Is he the sharpest leg on the spider? No. Is he brain dead? No. The fact that the strength, durability, and even size of conjured objects can vary depending on the user's proficiency in conjuration and their aura output should be pretty basic stuff for someone of Uvo's experience level. As such, as a veteran Nen combatant and the Phantom Troops vanguard along with Nobunaga ever since the troops' founding, Uvo really should have at the very least been certain that the chains were indeed conjured. If he then, in the heat of battle, made an error of somehow entirely forgetting that objects and substances made of aura can be inned to make them imperceptible, I'd begrudgingly accept that as, while still an incredibly convenient, nonetheless viable explanation. I don't think it's accidental this detail was completely skipped over in the 2011 anime. Kurapika's and Uvo's encounter works much better without it. Number 3. Hisoka's Texture Surprise. I've mentioned this a few times by now, but Hisoka's Texture Surprise may be the most inconsistent ability in the whole of Hunter x Hunter, bar none. Essentially, almost every time we see it, it acts fundamentally differently. The first time it was introduced against Castro, it was established by Togashi in chapter 55 of the manga to be nothing more than a parlor trick, essentially, as Hisoka could only use it to manifest images on smooth papery surfaces, making it very useful when paired with his world-class sleight of hand and misdirection for pulling off his magic tricks and performances. It was initially explicitly stated that he cannot copy textures and that physical contact with it would give give away the wrong texture. But Hisoka liked it because it made his deceptions more challenging and exciting. The ability's full name was even introduced as Texture Surprise, Flimsy Lies. Fast forward a bit to chapter 80, and Texture Surprise is now explicitly stated as indeed capable of replicating textures. This was incredibly important as it was potentially pivotal in allowing Hisoka to alter his fortune later on in chapter 106, and thus not only successfully deceive the troop into A, not ganging up on him and tearing him a new one as soon as they saw his fortune, as his original one revealed he had willingly bartered with Kurapika, and B, also convinced them to stay in Yorknew longer than they otherwise might have, all in an effort to force Crollo to fight him. If Texture Surprise was really as flimsy as the name suggested, someone among the troop, many of whom are perception monsters mind you, would have assuredly noticed something was off via either sight or touch, as not all paper has the same texture, as Hisoka's fortune was being passed around among them. The reason why this is relevant is because apart from keeping Hisoka alive, this successful deception down the line facilitated the events as we saw them transpire in Yorknew, namely the sealing of Crollo's Nen as well as Paku's death. Fast forward yet again all the way to chapter 357, and Texture Surprise can now apparently be applied directly to and paired with bungee gum to mask Hisoka's ghoulish appearance following his very much one-sided deathmatch against Crollo. This definitely goes beyond the simple parlor trick Texture Surprise was initially supposed to be, and can now make his bungee prosthetics appear to be his genuine skin, clothing, and so on. The reason this is relevant is because the troop is currently on the hunt for Hisoka, and had his face remained disfigured and his bungee prosthetics plainly visible, or rather invisible to the general public if they were simply transmuted instead of properly conjured, this would have made the troop's job of finding him much easier than simply looking into anyone vaguely matching Hisoka's height. It also may have given him many additional options as well, but I'll get into that in a separate video. Number 4. Heaven's Arena in general. Seriously, it's so bad. This video idea came about because I initially wanted to make one detailing all the things Heaven's Arena screws up. The biggest and most obvious one is, of course, Nen being on full display. However, since it is very obvious, and since I'm sure everyone and their mother has talked about it to death over the years, I won't focus on it too much here. All I'll say is that the average Heaven's Arena enjoyer probably sees what the fighters above the 200th floor do as either being fake, some advanced tech, weapons are allowed after all, or recognizes it as some kind of supernatural force, but simply has no way to learn about it more. Magical beasts are a known part of the world after all. Now, what is interesting to consider is whether the Heaven's Arena staff actually know about Nen, particularly the commentators and judges. Do they know about it but just can't say anything, or are they in the dark and are just figuring stuff out as they go along? Quite frankly, I've also no idea why a judge is even present at a floor master battle. Even if they were experienced, there's no way in hell a non-Nen awakened, non-combatant judge would be able to follow half of what the fighters of floor master caliber are doing most of the time. Especially when Nen is involved, but that's neither here nor there. Speaking of Nen, isn't having your name and face plastered in public a huge liability to any Nen user, but particularly those against whom people might hold a grudge, like Hisoka or Crollo? I mean, I know they both, Hisoka in particular, welcome all challengers, but there's a lot of annoying abilities the conditions of which could be met by the user simply knowing his target's name and seeing their face in person, as a member of the audience, for example. Abilities that have to do with tracking someone's movements or minor to moderate level curses could and realistically should pose a genuine nuisance. Apart from that, it's mind-boggling that an 11-year-old can apparently run away from home, come to Heaven's Arena, sign a legally enforceable waiver, and then get 50 IQ stomped out of his skull when he comes across a particularly nasty opponent. What kind of libertarian hellscape or insane corporatocracy would need to be in place for something like that to even be possible? I guess the influence of whichever organization or individual runs Heaven's Arena is also responsible for why the Hunter Association hasn't dismantled the whole thing already. The final issue with Heaven's Arena is, of course, Crollo being a floor master and using his real name to fight. If Crollo held the title of floor master before the Yorknew arc began, why wouldn't have Hisoka speedrun spedrun his 10 matches and then challenged Chrollo for his floor master title. From what we've been told, that's how the system works. A fighter needs to win 10 out of 13 matches and then challenge a specific floor master for their title and floor. That, by far, seems to be the easiest and most straightforward route to getting a proper 1v1 against him when compared to Hisoka's convoluted and mostly impromptu plan to get Chrollo to fight him in Yorknew. This, apparently not being an option for our killer clown, implies that either A. Chrollo wasn't using his real name and may have even used a disguise in his previous matches, which is incredibly unlikely considering the announcer never mentioned anything of the sort was amiss. Or B. Chrollo became a floor master somewhere between regaining his Nen and the deathmatch. This would have again been pretty awkward timing-wise, since Chrollo would have needed to have won probably at least a few matches and then challenged a floor master for their title, while having Hisoka hot on his heels throughout. Chrollo suddenly making an appearance in Heaven's Arena under his real name would have not only attracted Hisoka, but also potentially Kurapika. Even if Kurapika was now primarily focused on getting the eyes of his clansmen back instead of pursuing revenge, he realistically should have at least informed other blacklist hunters in the association who Chrollo actually was, since, as I'll talk about in another video, his identity was not public knowledge. We do know that Dogman, a professional wrestler and member of Morena's murder flock, was a big fan of Chrollo's fighting career, meaning that Chrollo had to have some degree of fame and couldn't have been slipping entirely under the radar. All this makes it incredibly weird how exactly he was able to stall Hisoka for so long, as well as how and why Kurapika, along with the other blacklist hunters like Sayu and Lippo, or even the Zodiacs in general, regardless of their hunting query, didn't see fit to take any kind of action and wasted such a golden opportunity as was nabbing an A-class bounty and high-level threat as Chrollo, supposing they knew about his identity as the head of the spider, of course. Actually, in theory, letting the match between Hisoka and Chrollo happen and then jumping Chrollo after the fact would have been a decent plan, for example. Speaking of Morena's murder flock, number 5. The conclusion of Morena's and Borksen's negotiation game. Borksen was robbed. I will die on this hill, alone if I have to very quickly remind you of the whole setup. The fake Morena Prudo had Bork captured and taken to their hideout after Dogman identified her as a specialist, forcing her to play her negotiation game. The game itself is primarily a luck-based card game where the dealer starts with 7 cards face up, while the player has 5 cards face down. The dealer, i.e. Morena, opens up by making a request of the player, i.e. Borksen, with her request in this case being that Bork join their ranks. The player then chooses among the dealer's 7 face-up cards, each of which tells the player something about their circumstances as well as Morena herself. This includes cards like the Aim card, which reveals Morena's goals, and the relevant for us now, Power card, which reveals Morena's ability. For every face-up card a player picks in this way, a random card of theirs is discarded. Whichever card among the 5 face-down ones the player has is the last one remaining, serves as the answer to Morena's request, with the possible answers being yes, meaning the player has become a preliminary member of the group, no, meaning death, and X, which nullifies the game and serves as the get-out-of-jail-free card. Answering Morena's request with a yes card is also one of the requirements needed for someone to become imbued with contagion. Morena's ability, which allows for her followers to level up their Nen through murder, with the purpose of attaining and then upgrading a Hatsu of their own, with the ultimate purpose of realizing Morena's plan to kill everyone aboard the Black Whale, then Kakin, and ultimately the world. Getting back to Bork now. Borksen manages to seemingly clutch it at the very end by getting the ability to return to her hand and answer the negotiation game with the X card, which would invalidate the game. However, instead of choosing the X card, in a Dark Continent-worthy twist, she instead answers the game with the Yes card. No, not because of a sudden change of alignment from neutral good to chaotic evil, but because she was compelled to do so by Morena's ability as a consequence of having cheated. See, at the very beginning, Morena said to Bork that withdrawing from the game would mean losing the freedom to do anything other than answering with yes or no, and then smugly claimed that Bork should have intuited that cheating is tantamount to withdrawing from the game. Sounds reasonable, right? Right? Yeah. Not to me. While Morena was explaining the game to Bork, she stated the following: "Although it might go over your head a little bit, I'll tell you only the truth without hiding anything. I'll go into as much detail as you want until you understand." However, when Bork chose the power card, which was supposed to explain Morena's ability in full, Morena never at any point mentioned that cheating would, and I quote, automatically trigger the manipulative aspect of the ability. What automatic manipulative aspect of your ability, Morena? While you might have casually insinuated that something like that at the very beginning to a person that knows nothing about Nen, and this game cannot be played with awakened Nen users as far as we know anyway, but that really sounds like something that should have been explicitly established as an important mechanic of your ability. When I start talking in the second person to imaginary characters, you know things have gotten bad. By not mentioning it in any way when Bork explicitly picked the power card, Morena went back on her promise to tell only the truth without hiding anything. Also, I really feel like the fact that cheating entails abandoning the match really should have been established as well. There are competitive settings in which cheating doesn't entail disqualification, but can instead lead to either nullification or specific penalties. So this whole, you should have intuited that cheating is tantamount to abandoning this serious game bullcrap is just that. Bullcrap. Let's not even get into the fact that in an alternate translation, Morena says fair game instead of serious game. There was nothing fair about it from the moment Bork got kidnapped and put on the casting couch. But since the official translation doesn't use that phrase, I'll contain my weeb rage. Due to all the aforementioned, from a storytelling perspective, this twist for me felt forced. But apart from the storytelling aspect, there's one more almost equally as important one I need to super briefly mention at the end here. Ability balancing. Morena's ability is way too powerful. I go into this in my Hatsu levels ranked specialization video, but Morena's ability is the most mechanically complex specialization-based ability we've seen in the series, and is absolutely among the most powerful as well. Apart from allowing 22 people to speedrun years upon years of training in mere days, it allows her to keep tabs on them, exert certain control over them, assist them in developing their Hatsu in a certain direction, and may even unlock an additional ability for her as well, since she can also apparently gain levels. To make it worse, it's an individual's ability and not a symbiotic one like 9th Prince Halkenberg's overpowered arrow. A specialist with a somewhat comparable overpowered ability, namely Krollo, has a whole laundry list of conditions he needs to fulfill and restrictions he needs to abide by in order to steal and maintain someone's ability. If on top of all the things her ability can do, her conditions are loose enough to allow Morena the wiggle room to lie through omission, I frankly think that's absurd. And that's some of the biggest, and for the most part, most narratively relevant plot holes in Hunter x Hunter done. There were a few others I could have included, but I, for the most part, either considered them as one-off inconsistencies that are entirely inconsequential, such as Killua recognizing Zeno's dragon dive during the palace invasion, despite, realistically, never having had the opportunity to see his grandfather's ability, or were already covered by other, bigger YouTubers, such as Hikarugo not knowing about Hagia changing his name to Leol, meaning that I didn't see much point in talking about them myself. With that said, what plot hole, inconsistency, or retcon do you think would be a good fit for this list? Is there enough to make a part 2? Feel more than free to share your thoughts down in the comments below. Before signing off, I'd very much like to thank the thinkers and overthinkers for going the extra mile in supporting the channel. As always, thank you very much for watching, your feedback is always appreciated, subscribe if you'd like more content like this, and I'll see you in the next one.